She was 18 years old when she married a 72-year-old sultan. Everyone expected the wedding night to end in tears of fear and submission. Instead, it ended with screams that nobody could have predicted. What happened in that palace room changed not just her life, but the lives of thousands of women across an entire region. A story of unexpected love, courage, and the power of choosing principles over comfort. A journey that proves sometimes the most beautiful transformations come from the most unlikely beginnings. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart and remind you that real strength comes from staying true to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment where you're watching from. The words came like a verdict, delivered over breakfast on a Tuesday morning when the spring air still carried the coolness of winter. Isabella Martinez sat at the mahogany table in her family's estate, her coffee growing cold as her father's voice echoed through the dining room. "You will marry a man of great respect," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions or protests. She was 18 years old, and in that moment, she understood that her childhood had just ended. The man was Sultan Rashid al-Mansuri, a 72-year-old widower who ruled a small but wealthy nation in the Middle East with absolute authority. Isabella learned about him through whispered conversations between her parents and fragmented newspaper clippings her mother left strategically around the house. He was not a monster, they assured her. He was educated in London, spoke 4 languages fluently, and was known for his diplomatic grace. His first wife had passed away 5 years earlier, and he had no children to inherit his throne. The meeting was arranged for the following week at the Palazzo San Marco, a historic villa overlooking the Mediterranean coast. Isabella spent those 7 days in a strange limbo, floating between her regular life and the reality that awaited her. She continued her university literature classes, met friends for coffee, and read poetry in the garden as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She could feel it in the way her mother watched her with a mixture of pride and sorrow, and in how her father avoided her eyes entirely. When the day arrived, Isabella chose her simplest dress, a cream-colored linen that belonged to her grandmother. She wanted to look respectable but not eager, composed but not compliant. The drive to the palazzo took 45 minutes, and she spent every minute staring out the window at the olive groves and vineyards that dotted the countryside, wondering if this would be the last time she would see them as a free woman. The palazzo was magnificent in a way that felt almost oppressive. Ancient stone walls covered in climbing jasmine, fountains that sang with the sound of falling water, and gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Sultan Rashid was waiting for her on the main terrace, standing with his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the sea. He was not what she had expected. There was no ostentation in his appearance, no gold jewelry or elaborate robes. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, and when he turned to greet her, his eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences she could not yet imagine. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his presence. His hair was completely silver, combed back from a face that bore the lines of 7 decades of life. His voice was soft when he spoke, barely above a whisper, and he had a habit of pausing between sentences as if carefully weighing each word. "Isabella," he said when her father introduced them. "A beautiful name for a beautiful young woman." He extended his hand, and when she took it, she was surprised by how gentle his grip was. They sat together on the terrace while their fathers discussed arrangements inside the villa. The conversation was stilted at first, filled with polite inquiries about her studies and his travels. But as the afternoon wore on, Isabella found herself genuinely curious about this man who would become her husband. He told her about his country, a small nation nestled between larger powers, where ancient traditions coexisted with modern ambitions. He spoke about his love for astronomy, his collection of rare books, and his efforts to bring education to rural communities. "Why me?" she finally asked as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a question that had been burning inside her since her father's announcement, and she could no longer contain it. The Sultan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Because," he said eventually, "sometimes the most important alliances are built not on power or wealth, but on the possibility of understanding." She did not fully comprehend what he meant then, but she would remember those words in the difficult months that followed. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and those 21 days passed in a blur of preparations and mounting anxiety. Isabella's mother transformed into a whirlwind of activity, coordinating with seamstresses and caterers and protocol experts. There were fittings for the wedding gown, a magnificent creation of silk and pearls that had been worn by women in the Sultan's family for generations. There were lessons in court etiquette, crash courses in Arabic customs, and briefings on the political significance of her upcoming union. Through it all, Isabella felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She attended every appointment and meeting with dutiful compliance, but her mind remained detached, as if she was observing these events from a great distance. Her friends tried to comfort her with reassurances that arranged marriages could lead to love, that the Sultan seemed kind, that she was fortunate to be entering such a prestigious alliance. But Isabella could not shake the feeling that she was disappearing, piece by piece, with each decision made on her behalf. The night before the wedding, she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the familiar shadows of furniture and photographs that had defined her world for 18 years. Tomorrow, she would leave this room and this house and this life, and she had no idea who she would become in the process. She thought about the books she would have to leave behind, the university degree she would never complete, the dreams she had never even had the chance to articulate. The fear that consumed her was not of the Sultan himself, but of losing herself entirely in the vastness of his world. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of orange blossoms from the palazzo gardens. Isabella woke before sunrise and spent the early morning hours walking through her family's grounds one last time, memorizing the way the light fell through the cypress trees and the sound of birds singing in the herb garden. Her mother found her there as the sun crested the horizon, tears streaming down both their faces as they embraced in silence. The ceremony itself was a blend of Christian and Islamic traditions, conducted in 3 languages that Isabella barely understood. She stood beside the Sultan in the palazzo's main hall, surrounded by diplomats and dignitaries from around the world, feeling like an actress playing a role she had never auditioned for. The vows were translated for her benefit, but the words felt hollow and foreign in her mouth. When the Sultan slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, a magnificent sapphire surrounded by diamonds, she felt the weight of it like a shackle. The reception that followed was a grand affair, with hundreds of guests celebrating what everyone described as a perfect union between 2 ancient families. Isabella smiled and nodded and accepted congratulations with grace, but she felt as if she was floating above the festivities, watching them unfold from a great height. The Sultan remained at her side throughout the evening, occasionally touching her arm or shoulder in a gesture of support, but they barely spoke. There was too much noise, too many people, too much expectation surrounding their every move. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Isabella felt a growing sense of dread about what would come next. The wedding night loomed before her like an insurmountable obstacle, and she found herself struggling to breathe as the palazzo grew quiet around them. The Sultan noticed her distress and guided her to a small sitting room away from the lingering staff and family members. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked gently, settling into a chair across from her instead of beside her. The question caught her off guard with its directness and compassion. Isabella considered lying, offering some polite reassurance that would smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. Instead, she found herself speaking the truth. "Yes," she whispered. "I am terrified." The Sultan nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. "Good," he said. "Fear can be a form of wisdom, especially for someone as young as you entering a world as complicated as mine." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes serious and kind. "I want you to know that nothing will happen tonight, or any night, until you are ready. This marriage may have been arranged by our families, but what happens between us as individuals will be decided by us alone." His words should have brought relief, but Isabella found herself even more confused. "I don't understand," she said. "Isn't this what marriages are for? Isn't this what's expected?" The Sultan's expression grew distant, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 72 years. "Expectations can be prisons," he said quietly. "I learned that lesson with my first wife, and I will not repeat those mistakes with you." He stood and moved toward the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. "You remind me of her, you know. Young, intelligent, terrified of disappearing into someone else's life. I failed her in many ways, and I will not fail you in the same manner." Isabella felt a surge of curiosity about this first wife, this woman whose memory seemed to haunt the Sultan's every decision. But before she could ask about her, he turned back with a gentle smile. "You should rest now. Tomorrow we leave for my country, and you will need your strength for the adjustments ahead." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Isabella, I want you to remember something. You may be my wife according to law and custom, but you are still yourself. Do not let anyone, including me, convince you otherwise." With that, he left her alone in the sitting room, and Isabella found herself staring at the closed door in bewilderment. This was not how she had imagined her wedding night would unfold. There had been no romance, but also no force, no passion, but also no violation. Instead, there had been kindness and respect, and a promise that she was not sure she understood, but that filled her with something that might have been hope. She made her way to the bridal suite that had been prepared for them, a magnificent room decorated with silk tapestries and fresh flowers. The bed was enormous, draped in fine linens and scattered with rose petals. Isabella sat on the edge of it, still wearing her wedding gown, and tried to process everything that had happened. The Sultan did not join her that night. She later learned that he had taken a room in another wing of the palazzo, maintaining the fiction of their wedding night while respecting the boundary he had promised to observe. The journey to the Sultan's country took 2 days by private plane, and Isabella spent most of the flight staring out the window at the changing landscape below. They flew over mountains and deserts, ancient cities and modern metropolises, until finally they descended toward a small nation that seemed to exist at the crossroads between East and West. The capital city was a fascinating blend of traditional architecture and contemporary innovation, with minarets and skyscrapers sharing the same skyline. The Sultan's palace was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. It was not the opulent fantasy she had imagined, but rather a complex of interconnected buildings that seemed to grow organically from the desert landscape. The walls were made of local stone that changed color with the light, appearing golden in the morning and deep red at sunset. Gardens and courtyards were scattered throughout the complex, creating private spaces that offered respite from the intensity of palace life. Isabella was given her own suite of rooms in the women's quarters, a beautiful space decorated with traditional textiles and modern amenities. She had a bedroom, a sitting room, a private bathroom, and a small study lined with empty bookshelves. The windows looked out over an internal courtyard where a fountain played among orange trees and flowering vines. It was lovely and comfortable, and felt nothing like a prison. But Isabella still struggled with the isolation of her new position. The first few weeks in the palace passed in a haze of cultural orientation and protocol training. Isabella met with various officials and advisors who explained the customs and expectations that would govern her new life. She learned about the hierarchies within the palace, the proper forms of address for different ranks of people, and the subtle codes of behavior that distinguished insiders from outsiders. There were language lessons with a patient tutor who helped her navigate the complexities of Arabic grammar and pronunciation. The Sultan maintained a respectful distance during this adjustment period, checking on her welfare through intermediaries and ensuring that she had everything she needed. They saw each other briefly at formal occasions, where they played their roles as newlyweds with practiced grace, but there was little private interaction between them. Isabella appreciated his consideration, but she also felt adrift in this new world, without any real anchor or guide. It was during her 3rd week in the palace that Isabella met Amara, the head librarian who would become her first real friend in this strange new life. Amara was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, who spoke perfect English and seemed genuinely interested in Isabella's well-being. She found Isabella wandering the palace corridors one afternoon, clearly lost and frustrated, and offered to give her a proper tour of the complex. The library was Amara's domain, a magnificent space with soaring ceilings and walls lined with books in dozens of languages. There were ancient manuscripts and modern publications, works of literature and philosophy and science, all carefully catalogued and preserved. Isabella felt immediately at home among the familiar smell of paper and ink, and Amara noticed her reaction with approval. "You are a reader," Amara observed, pulling a volume of poetry from a nearby shelf. "This will be a comfort to you here, where books are valued as much as gold." She handed Isabella the collection, a work by a contemporary Middle Eastern poet whose verses explored themes of identity and belonging. The Sultan is a great lover of literature himself. His private collection contains some of the rarest manuscripts in the world. This revelation surprised Isabella, who had not yet seen this intellectual side of her husband. "Does he spend much time here?" she asked, running her fingers along the leather binding of the poetry collection. Amara smiled knowingly. "More than you might expect. He often comes here late at night when the palace is quiet, searching for answers to questions that trouble him. Perhaps you will encounter him during one of your visits." There was something in her tone that suggested this meeting would not be entirely accidental, and Isabella felt a flutter of curiosity about what such an encounter might reveal. The opportunity arose sooner than expected. Isabella had taken to visiting the library in the evenings after dinner, finding solace in the quiet atmosphere and the company of books that reminded her of home. She was deep in a historical account of the region's ancient trade routes when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The Sultan appeared in the doorway, looking surprised to find her there. "Isabella," he said softly, "I hope I am not disturbing you." He was dressed casually in dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, and he looked younger somehow in the soft light of the reading lamps. "Not at all," she replied, closing her book and starting to rise from her chair. "I was just reading about the Silk Road and its influence on local culture. Amara recommended this author." The Sultan gestured for her to remain seated and moved to browse the nearby shelves. "Amara has excellent taste in recommendations. That particular historian spent years researching in our archives and understands the complexity of our heritage better than most scholars." He pulled a slim volume from the shelf and held it up for her to see. "Have you encountered the work of our modern poets? They write about the challenges of preserving tradition while embracing change." This began a series of evening conversations that gradually became the highlight of Isabella's days. The Sultan would arrive at the library after his official duties were completed, and they would discuss books and ideas and the broader questions that shaped human experience. Isabella discovered that he was extraordinarily well-read, with interests that ranged from astronomy to philosophy to agricultural innovation. More importantly, she found that he listened to her opinions with genuine attention and respect, treating her as an intellectual equal despite her youth and inexperience. These conversations revealed layers of complexity in the Sultan that Isabella had not suspected. He spoke about the loneliness of absolute power, the difficulty of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and the constant tension between personal desires and public responsibilities. He told her about his efforts to modernize his country without destroying its cultural foundation, about the resistance he faced from conservative elements who viewed change as betrayal. "Leadership," he said one evening as they sat in comfortable chairs facing each other across a small table laden with tea and dates, "is the art of disappointing people at a rate they can tolerate. Every decision alienates someone, and the challenge is to choose your disappointments wisely." He sipped his tea thoughtfully before continuing. "I have been making these choices for 40 years, and I am tired of the weight of them." Isabella sensed there was more he wanted to say, some deeper burden he was struggling to articulate. "Is that why you married me?" she asked gently. "To share that weight somehow?" The Sultan set down his teacup and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Partially," he admitted, "but not in the way you might think. I did not marry you to find someone to carry my burdens, but rather to remember what it feels like to see the world through younger eyes. Your perspective challenges my assumptions and reminds me of possibilities I had forgotten." This confession left Isabella both flattered and troubled. She appreciated being valued for her mind and her fresh viewpoint, but she worried about the pressure of such expectations. What if she disappointed him? What if her youthful perspective proved naive or inadequate when confronted with the complexities of governance? She voiced these concerns, and the Sultan's response surprised her with its thoughtfulness. "The value of youth," he said, "is not in having all the answers, but in asking questions that experience has taught us to stop asking. You see problems that I no longer notice because I have become accustomed to them. You suggest solutions that I dismiss too quickly, because I remember why they failed in the past. This fresh perspective is not a burden for you to bear, but a gift you naturally possess." As the weeks turned into months, Isabella began to find her place within the palace community. The formal protocols that had initially seemed overwhelming became familiar routines, and she developed relationships with the staff and officials who managed the daily operations of the government. She was particularly drawn to the women who worked in various administrative roles, finding in them examples of how traditional culture could coexist with professional ambition. One of these women was Layla, a young attorney who served as an advisor on legal reforms affecting women's rights. Layla was brilliant and passionate, fighting to expand educational and economic opportunities for women, while respecting the cultural frameworks that gave their society stability and identity. She and Isabella spent hours discussing the challenges of advocating for change within established systems, and Layla became both a mentor and a friend during those crucial early months. Through Layla, Isabella learned about the complex political dynamics that shaped the Sultan's decision-making. There were progressive factions that pushed for rapid modernization, conservative groups that resisted any deviation from traditional practices, and moderate voices that sought compromise between competing interests. The Sultan's role was to navigate these competing pressures, while maintaining the stability and prosperity that had defined his reign. Isabella also learned about the Sultan's first wife, Yasmin, whose memory continued to influence palace life 5 years after her death. Yasmin had been beloved by the people for her charitable work and cultural patronage, but she had struggled with depression and isolation in her final years. Her death had been sudden and tragic, and the Sultan's grief had left him withdrawn from public life for more than a year. She was very young when they married, Layla explained during one of their conversations. 17 years old and completely unprepared for the demands of royal life. She tried to fulfill everyone's expectations, but the pressure eventually became unbearable. The Sultan blames himself for not protecting her better, for not seeing how much she was suffering until it was too late. This information helped Isabella understand her husband's careful approach to their relationship. His promise that nothing would happen between them until she was ready was not just about physical intimacy, but about emotional preparation for the challenges of her new role. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had cost his first wife so dearly. The first real crisis of Isabella's new life came during her 4th month in the palace, when political tensions in a neighboring country threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Sultan was forced to make difficult decisions about military alliances and economic sanctions, choices that would affect thousands of lives and potentially reshape the balance of power in the area. Isabella watched him struggle with these decisions, seeing how the weight of responsibility aged him before her eyes. During this period, their evening conversations in the library became more intense and urgent. The Sultan shared his doubts and fears with Isabella in a way that he could not with his official advisors, seeking not specific guidance, but simply the comfort of being understood. Isabella found herself offering emotional support rather than political advice, providing a safe space where the Sultan could express his vulnerabilities without compromising his public authority. One particularly difficult evening, after news had arrived of civilian casualties in the neighboring conflict, the Sultan broke down completely. Isabella found him in the library with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Without thinking, she moved to sit beside him and gently touched his arm, offering the simple comfort of human contact. He leaned into her touch, and for a moment they sat together in the profound intimacy of shared sorrow. "I ordered those airstrikes," he whispered. "I knew civilians might die, and I ordered them anyway because the alternative was worse. How does a person live with such choices? How does anyone sleep at night knowing they have blood on their hands?" Isabella had no easy answers to offer, but she stayed with him until the worst of his anguish had passed. In that moment, she realized that their relationship had shifted into something deeper than the careful friendship they had been cultivating. They were becoming true partners, bound together not by physical passion but by emotional honesty and mutual support. The resolution of the regional crisis came after weeks of delicate negotiations and painful compromises. The Sultan's decisions were ultimately vindicated by events, but the personal cost had been enormous. He emerged from the experience more gray and worn, carrying new lines of stress around his eyes and mouth. Isabella had supported him throughout the ordeal, and their bond had strengthened in ways that surprised them both. It was during this period that Isabella first began to understand the true nature of the political arrangement that had brought about their marriage. Through careful listening and discreet questioning, she learned that her father's business interests in the Sultan's country were far more extensive than she had realized. The marriage had been designed to cement an economic partnership that would benefit both families enormously, with Isabella serving as the human guarantee of their mutual commitment. This discovery filled her with a mixture of anger and sadness. She felt manipulated by her father, who had presented the marriage as a matter of family honor rather than business advantage. She felt sorry for the Sultan, who had been pressured into the arrangement by advisors who saw political benefit in the alliance. Most of all, she felt disillusioned about her own role in the entire situation, realizing that she had been treated as a commodity rather than a person. When she confronted the Sultan about this revelation, he did not deny the political motivations behind their marriage. Instead, he spoke honestly about the pressures that had influenced his decision and his regret about the way the arrangement had been presented to her. "You are right to be angry," he said quietly. "You deserve to know the full truth from the beginning, and I failed you by allowing others to control that narrative. I can only say that while our marriage began as a political convenience, what has developed between us is real and valuable, and entirely our own creation." Isabella appreciated his honesty, even as she struggled with the implications of what she had learned. She realized that she faced a choice about how to move forward. She could allow this knowledge to poison her relationship with the Sultan, Or she could accept the circumstances that had brought them together while focusing on what they could build from that foundation. She chose to move forward, but with a new understanding of her own agency within the marriage. If she was going to be part of a political alliance, she would make sure her voice was heard in the decisions that affected her life and the lives of others. She began attending policy meetings as an observer, gradually working her way into more active participation as the Sultan's advisors recognized her intelligence and insight. This transition was not without resistance. Some members of the court viewed Isabella's increasing involvement in political matters as inappropriate, particularly given her youth and foreign background. There were whispered complaints about her influence over the Sultan and suggestions that she was overstepping traditional boundaries. The Sultan addressed these concerns directly, making it clear that Isabella's participation had his full support and that any disrespect toward her would be considered a personal affront. The confrontation came to a head during a heated cabinet meeting about education policy, when one of the older ministers openly questioned Isabella's right to express opinions about matters affecting the country's children. The room fell silent as everyone waited to see how the Sultan would respond to this direct challenge to his wife's authority. "Minister Hassan," the Sultan said in a voice that carried unmistakable authority, "my wife has spent more time in classrooms and universities than most of the people in this room. Her insights into education are based on recent personal experience rather than distant memories. I suggest you listen to what she has to say before dismissing her contributions." The minister backed down, but the incident marked a turning point in Isabella's integration into the palace power structure. She had been publicly defended by the Sultan and tacitly accepted by the cabinet as a legitimate participant in policy discussions. It was a victory that felt both satisfying and overwhelming, as Isabella realized she was taking on responsibilities she had never imagined when she first arrived in this strange new world. As her first year in the palace drew to a close, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had arrived as a frightened teenager, forced into a marriage she did not want with a man she did not know. She was ending that year as a confident young woman with genuine influence in matters of state, married to a man she had grown to respect and care for deeply. The relationship between Isabella and the Sultan had evolved into something neither of them had expected. It was not the romantic love that fairy tales promised, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on intellectual compatibility, emotional support, and shared commitment to using their positions for positive change. They had found ways to honor both the political necessity that had brought them together and the human connection that had grown between them. But as Isabella prepared for whatever challenges the next year might bring, she could not shake the feeling that their carefully constructed equilibrium was about to be tested in ways they had not yet imagined. There were storms gathering on the horizon, both political and personal, that would require all the strength and wisdom they had built together. The true test of their partnership was still to come, and Isabella could only hope that what they had created would prove strong enough to survive whatever lay ahead. The second year of Isabella's marriage began with an unexpected invitation that would change everything. A delegation from her home country was scheduled to visit the palace for trade negotiations, and among the diplomats was her younger brother Miguel, whom she had not seen since her wedding day. The prospect of this reunion filled Isabella with excitement and anxiety in equal measure, as she wondered how much she had changed and whether Miguel would recognize the woman she had become. The preparations for the diplomatic visit consumed the palace for weeks. Every detail was scrutinized, from the menu selections to the flower arrangements, as the Sultan's staff worked to ensure that the negotiations would proceed smoothly. Isabella found herself caught between two worlds, serving as both hostess to the foreign delegation and cultural interpreter for her husband's advisors. It was a delicate balance that required all the diplomatic skills she had developed during her time in the palace. When Miguel finally arrived, Isabella barely recognized the young man who stepped out of the diplomatic vehicle. Her little brother, who had been only 16 when she left home, had grown into a tall, confident university student, with their father's serious eyes and their mother's gentle smile. Their reunion was emotional, but carefully orchestrated, taking place in a formal reception room with numerous witnesses, rather than the private embrace Isabella had imagined. During the public ceremonies and official dinners that marked the delegation's visit, Isabella and Miguel had little opportunity for private conversation. But Isabella could see the questions in his eyes, the concern he tried to hide behind diplomatic politeness. He was studying her carefully, looking for signs of unhappiness or distress, and she found herself performing the role of contented wife with more intensity than usual, desperate to convince him that she was truly well. The opportunity for honest conversation finally came during a cultural tour of the palace gardens. when Isabella was able to guide Miguel away from the main group for a few precious minutes of privacy. They found themselves beside an ancient fountain surrounded by blooming oleander trees, the sound of falling water providing cover for their whispered words. "Are you truly happy here?" Miguel asked without preamble, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Mother cries every night, wondering if we made a terrible mistake. Father insists that you are living like a queen, but we have had no real word from you in months." Isabella felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. The letters she had sent home had been formal and cheerful, designed to reassure her family rather than reveal her true experiences. She had not written about her loneliness during those first weeks, her struggles to find her place in the palace hierarchy, or the complex emotions she felt toward her husband. She had certainly not mentioned the growing political role she was beginning to play, knowing that such information might complicate the very negotiations Miguel was there to conduct. "I am learning to be happy," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision she had developed during months of diplomatic conversations. "This life is different from anything I could have imagined, but it has its own rewards and satisfactions. The Sultan is a good man, Miguel. He has been kind and patient with me." Miguel studied her face with the intensity of someone who had known her all her life. "That is not the same as love," he said quietly. "You always said you would marry for love, that you would choose your own path. I hate that we took that choice away from you." The pain in her brother's voice nearly broke Isabella's heart. She could see the guilt he carried, the sense that he had somehow failed to protect her from their father's ambitions. She wanted to comfort him, but she also needed him to understand that her situation was more complex than simple unhappiness or contentment. "Love comes in many forms," she said, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "What I have with the Sultan may not be the romantic love of fairy tales, but it is built on respect and understanding and shared purpose. We are partners in ways that matter, Miguel. That is more than many married couples can claim." Before Miguel could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of other delegation members, and the moment for private conversation was lost. But Isabella could see that her words had not entirely convinced him, and she spent the remainder of his visit trying to demonstrate through her actions that she had indeed found her place in this new world. The formal negotiations proceeded smoothly, with agreements reached on several important trade issues that would benefit both countries. Isabella played a subtle but crucial role in these discussions, using her unique position to facilitate communication and build trust between the two delegations. Her father's business interests featured prominently in the agreements, and Isabella finally understood the full extent of the economic arrangements that had motivated her marriage. On the final evening of the delegation's visit, the Sultan hosted a grand farewell dinner in the palace's most magnificent hall. Isabella wore a gown that had belonged to his first wife, a gesture that honored both the memory of Yasmin and Isabella's own growing status within the palace hierarchy. She moved through the evening's festivities with grace and confidence, serving as the perfect diplomatic hostess while managing her own emotional response to saying goodbye to Miguel once again. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Miguel found a way to speak with Isabella one final time. They stood together on the palace steps, surrounded by the bustle of diplomatic preparations, as he prepared to return to a world that increasingly felt foreign to her. "Promise me something," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Promise me that if you ever need help, if you ever want to come home, you will find a way to let us know. Father's business arrangements are important, but you are more important." "Never forget that," Isabella promised, though she was not certain she could ever bring herself to use such an escape route. As she watched the diplomatic convoy disappear into the desert night, she felt a profound sense of finality wash over her. The visit had marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another, though she could not yet see what that new chapter would contain. The weeks following the delegation's departure brought unexpected challenges that tested everything Isabella had learned about navigating palace politics. A scandal erupted involving one of the Sultan's closest advisors, who was discovered to have been embezzling funds intended for rural development projects. The revelation sent shockwaves through the government and provided ammunition for the Sultan's political opponents, who used the corruption as evidence of his failing leadership. Isabella watched her husband struggle with the crisis, seeing how the betrayal by a trusted friend wounded him more deeply than the political damage it caused. The advisor in question was a man the Sultan had known for decades, someone he had trusted with both state secrets and personal confidences. The discovery that this relationship had been built on deception and greed left the Sultan questioning his judgment about everyone around him. "How do I know who else is lying to me?" he asked Isabella during one of their evening conversations in the library. If Hassan could deceive me for years about something this significant, what other betrayals am I blind to? How does a leader govern effectively when he cannot trust his own advisors? Isabella had no easy answers to offer, but she found herself drawn deeper into the political crisis as the Sultan began to rely on her as one of the few people whose motivations he did not question. She attended strategy meetings, reviewed financial documents, and helped coordinate the investigation into the extent of the corruption. It was demanding work that required her to learn quickly about aspects of governance she had never previously encountered. The crisis deepened when it became clear that the embezzlement was part of a larger network of corruption involving several government officials and prominent business leaders. The Sultan faced pressure from various factions to either conduct a comprehensive investigation that might destabilize his government or to limit the inquiry to protect powerful interests. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had always haunted his leadership, but this time the stakes felt higher and the consequences more personal. Isabella found herself serving as both advisor and emotional support as the Sultan wrestled with these decisions. She helped him analyze the political implications of different approaches, while also providing the personal comfort he needed to cope with the stress and betrayal he was experiencing. Their relationship deepened as they worked together through the crisis, moving beyond intellectual partnership towards something that felt increasingly like genuine intimacy. The breakthrough came when Isabella suggested an approach that had not occurred to the Sultan's other advisors. Rather than focusing solely on punishment for the corruption that had already occurred, she proposed that they use the crisis as an opportunity to implement comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar problems in the future. This would allow the Sultan to demonstrate leadership and vision rather than simply reacting to the scandal. The reform package that emerged from this suggestion was ambitious and far-reaching, addressing everything from financial oversight to government transparency to citizen participation in governance. It represented exactly the kind of progressive change that the Sultan had always wanted to achieve, but had struggled to implement against conservative resistance. The corruption crisis had created a political opening for reforms that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Isabella played a crucial role in developing and promoting these reforms, using her growing network of relationships within the palace to build support among different factions. She worked closely with Layla and other progressive officials to ensure that the reforms included meaningful improvements in women's rights and educational opportunities. She also collaborated with moderate conservatives to address their concerns about preserving cultural traditions within the modernization process. The success of the reform initiative marked a turning point in Isabella's role within the government. She was no longer simply the Sultan's wife who occasionally offered advice, but rather a legitimate political actor with her own areas of expertise and influence. The transformation was recognized formally when the Sultan appointed her to chair a new commission on educational development, giving her official authority to pursue changes she had been advocating for months. But just as Isabella was beginning to feel confident in her new role, a crisis emerged that threatened to destroy everything she had built. The crisis began with a seemingly routine diplomatic reception for visiting officials from neighboring countries. Isabella was serving as hostess for the event, managing the complex protocol requirements and cultural sensitivities that such gatherings demanded. Everything was proceeding smoothly until one of the visiting diplomats, a man named Ambassador Karim from a traditionally conservative nation, made a comment that changed the entire trajectory of the evening. "Your Majesty," the ambassador said to the Sultan during the formal dinner, "I must congratulate you on your young wife's beauty and intelligence. She reminds me very much of my own daughter, who is about the same age. It is always gratifying to see how well-arranged marriages can work when the parties involved understand their proper roles." The comment was intended as a compliment, but it contained an implicit criticism that was not lost on anyone in the room. By emphasizing Isabella's youth and referring to proper roles, the ambassador was suggesting that she had been overstepping traditional boundaries with her increasing political involvement. The silence that followed his words was thick with tension, as everyone waited to see how the Sultan would respond. What happened next shocked everyone present, including Isabella herself. Instead of offering a diplomatic deflection or polite correction, the Sultan's response was immediate and heated. "Ambassador Karim," he said in a voice that carried across the entire hall, "my wife's role in this government is determined by her capabilities and my confidence in her judgment, not by your understanding of proper behavior for women. I suggest you focus on the business that brought you here, rather than offering unsolicited advice about my family." The rebuke was so sharp and public that it could not be ignored or smoothed over with diplomatic niceties. Ambassador Karim's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, and several other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Isabella felt her heart racing as she realized that the Sultan had just created a significant diplomatic incident in her defense, potentially damaging important relationships for the sake of protecting her honor. The remainder of the dinner passed in strained silence, with conversation reduced to stilted pleasantries and forced smiles. As soon as the last guest departed, Isabella found herself alone with the Sultan in his private study, where the full implications of what had occurred began to sink in. She was grateful for his defense of her position, but she was also terrified of the consequences it might bring. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I could have handled the ambassador's comments without creating a diplomatic crisis." The Sultan looked exhausted, running his hands through his silver hair in a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. "Perhaps you could have handled it better than I did," he admitted. "But I could not sit there and listen to him diminish your contributions with his outdated assumptions about women's capabilities. You have earned your place in this government through your own efforts, not through my indulgence." Isabella appreciated his support, but she was also concerned about the broader implications of the incident. What will this mean for our relationships with his country and others like it? Have we damaged important alliances for the sake of making a point about my role? The Sultan's response revealed the depth of the transformation that had occurred in their relationship over the past 2 years. "Isabella," he said, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, "there are some principles that matter more than diplomatic convenience. Your dignity and your right to be treated with respect are among those principles. I will not sacrifice them for political advantage, no matter what the cost might be." In that moment, Isabella realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful partnership they had built was evolving into something deeper and more personal, something that looked very much like the love she had once thought impossible in an arranged marriage. The Sultan's willingness to risk diplomatic relationships for her sake was not just about political support, but about genuine care and commitment that went far beyond the terms of their original agreement. The crisis that followed the diplomatic incident tested their relationship in ways neither of them had anticipated. Ambassador Karim's government filed formal complaints about the Sultan's behavior, threatening to withdraw from important trade agreements and security arrangements. Other conservative nations began to question whether the Sultan's modernization efforts were going too far, particularly regarding women's roles in government. The pressure mounted for weeks, with the Sultan's own advisors urging him to find some way to apologize or make amends. Throughout this period, Isabella watched her husband struggle with the competing demands of political necessity and personal principle. She could see the toll the crisis was taking on him, the way it aged him and wore down his usual confidence. She offered to step back from her official duties temporarily to ease the diplomatic pressure, but the Sultan refused to consider such a compromise. "If I back down now," he explained during one of their late-night strategy sessions, "it will not end with you. Every progressive reform we have achieved will be questioned and potentially reversed. The women who look to you as an example will lose faith in the possibility of change. The precedent we set here will affect not just our own country, but the entire region." Isabella understood the larger implications of their situation, but she also worried about the personal cost to the Sultan. He was 74 years old and had been carrying the burdens of leadership for most of his adult life. She did not want to be the cause of additional stress that might damage his health or undermine his legacy. Yet she also recognized that retreat was not really an option, given how much their actions had come to symbolize for progressive forces throughout the region. The resolution came from an unexpected source: the women of the Sultan's own country. Led by Layla and other female professionals, they organized a series of public demonstrations supporting Isabella's role in the government and calling for continued progress on women's rights. The demonstrations were peaceful but powerful, drawing thousands of participants and generating significant media attention both domestically and internationally. The sight of so many women publicly defending Isabella's position had a profound impact on the political dynamics surrounding the crisis. It became clear that backing down would not only disappoint progressive allies, but might actually destabilize the Sultan's domestic support base. The women who had gained opportunities and influence during his reign were not willing to see those gains sacrificed for diplomatic convenience. Isabella was deeply moved by this show of support, particularly since it came from women she had worked with but who had no obligation to risk their own positions for her sake. She realized that her role in the government had become about more than her personal relationship with the Sultan. She had become a symbol of possibility for countless women who were working to expand their own opportunities and influence. The international pressure began to ease as other nations recognized that the Sultan's position had broad popular support. Several progressive governments issued statements supporting his modernization efforts, and even some traditionally conservative allies began to distance themselves from Ambassador Karim's position. The crisis that had threatened to isolate the Sultan's government actually ended up strengthening his regional influence among reformist leaders. But the most significant outcome of the crisis was the change it brought about in Isabella's relationship with her husband. The Sultan's willingness to risk so much in her defense had moved their partnership into new emotional territory, and Isabella found herself struggling to understand her own feelings about these developments. She cared deeply for the Sultan and respected him enormously, but she was not certain whether what she felt constituted the romantic love she had once imagined as the foundation for marriage. The question became more pressing when the Sultan began to express his own emotional evolution more directly. Their conversations took on a more personal tone, and he began to share thoughts and feelings that went beyond their professional collaboration. He spoke about his gratitude for her companionship, his admiration for her courage and intelligence, and his growing dependence on her emotional support. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted one evening as they sat together in the garden watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. "After Yasmin died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I married you for political reasons and promised myself that I would be a good husband without asking for more than you were willing to give. But somewhere along the way, you became essential to my happiness in ways I did not anticipate." Isabella felt her heart racing as she listened to this confession. She had grown to care for the Sultan deeply, but she was still uncertain about the nature of her own feelings and what they meant for their future together. The age difference that had seemed insurmountable when they first met had become less significant as she matured and as he revealed the depth of his character, but it had not disappeared entirely. "I care for you too," she said carefully, taking his hand in hers. "More than I ever thought possible when we first married. But I am still learning who I am in this new life, and I do not want to make promises about feelings that might continue to evolve." The Sultan squeezed her hand gently and smiled with the patience that had characterized their entire relationship. "I am not asking for promises or declarations," he said. "I simply wanted you to know that you have brought joy back into my life at a time when I thought such happiness was no longer possible. Whatever develops between us will happen naturally, without pressure or expectations." This conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their marriage, one characterized by growing emotional intimacy alongside their existing intellectual and political partnership. They began to spend more time together outside of their official duties, taking long walks in the palace gardens, sharing meals in the privacy of their own quarters, and discovering the simple pleasures of companionship that had been missing from both their lives. Isabella found herself looking forward to these moments of quiet connection, appreciating the way the Sultan listened to her thoughts and dreams with genuine interest and respect. He encouraged her to pursue her own interests and ambitions, supporting her efforts to establish educational programs and cultural exchanges that reflected her personal values and priorities. Their relationship became a source of strength and comfort, rather than obligation or duty. But even as Isabella was finding happiness in her marriage, she could not escape the growing awareness that their time together might be limited. The Sultan was aging visibly, showing the effects of decades of stress and responsibility. He occasionally experienced episodes of fatigue or confusion that reminded both of them of his mortality and the likelihood that Isabella would eventually face widowhood at a young age. This awareness added a bittersweet quality to their happiness, making each moment together feel more precious, while also creating anxiety about an uncertain future. Isabella began to think seriously about what her life might look like after the Sultan's death, wondering whether she would remain in his country or return to her family, whether she would continue in political life or pursue other paths entirely. These questions became more urgent when the Sultan suffered a minor health crisis during their third year of marriage. He collapsed during a cabinet meeting, apparently from exhaustion and stress, and was confined to bed rest for several weeks on doctor's orders. Isabella found herself thrust into an even more prominent role as she helped manage government business during his recovery. But she was also confronted with the reality of how quickly their situation could change. During the Sultan's convalescence, Isabella spent long hours at his bedside, reading to him and managing the stream of officials who needed his input on various matters. It was during these intimate moments that she finally understood the true nature of her feelings for her husband. Seeing him vulnerable and dependent on her care revealed the depth of her emotional attachment, and she realized that what had grown between them was indeed a form of love, even if it differed from her youthful romantic fantasies. "I love you," she said one afternoon as they sat together in his study, the words emerging naturally and without calculation. "I do not know when it happened or exactly how, but it is true. You have become the most important person in my world." The Sultan's response was everything she could have hoped for and more. He pulled her into his arms with surprising strength and held her close, whispering his own declarations of love and gratitude against her hair. For the first time since their wedding night, Isabella felt that they were truly husband and wife in every sense that mattered, bound together by choice rather than obligation. Their newfound emotional intimacy brought with it a physical closeness that had been absent from their marriage until that point. The Sultan had kept his promise to wait until Isabella was ready, and she finally felt prepared to explore that dimension of their relationship. Their physical union, when it finally occurred, was gentle and patient, reflecting the deep affection and respect that had grown between them over years of partnership. Isabella discovered that physical intimacy with someone she truly cared for was entirely different from what she had feared during those terrifying early days of their marriage. There was no violence or domination, no reduction of her personhood to mere physical function. Instead, there was tenderness and mutual consideration, the expression of emotional connection that enhanced rather than threatened her sense of self. But just as Isabella was settling into this new phase of contentment and fulfillment, a revelation emerged that would test everything they had built together. The revelation came through Amara, the librarian who had become one of Isabella's closest friends and confidants. Amara requested a private meeting, her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety and distress. "There is something you need to know," Amara said without preamble, as they sat together in a secluded corner of the library. "Something about the circumstances of your marriage that goes beyond what you have already discovered about the political arrangements." Isabella felt a familiar chill of apprehension, the same feeling she had experienced when she first learned about her father's business interests in the Sultan's country. "What kind of something?" she asked, though she was not certain she wanted to hear the answer. Amara hesitated, clearly struggling with the decision to share information that might cause Isabella pain. "I have been debating whether to tell you this for months," she said finally. "But I believe you have the right to know the full truth about why the Sultan agreed to this marriage, even if that truth is complicated and potentially hurtful." The revelation that followed changed everything Isabella thought she understood about her marriage and her husband's motivations. According to Amara, who had access to confidential palace records through her position as head librarian, the Sultan had not simply agreed to the marriage for political reasons. He had specifically requested Isabella as his bride, after seeing photographs and reading reports about her provided by diplomatic contacts in her home country. The request had been motivated by Isabella's resemblance to his first wife Yasmin, not just in physical appearance but in background and temperament. Yasmin had also been young and European, also from a family with business connections to the Sultan's country, also educated and intelligent but unprepared for the demands of royal life. The similarities had been deliberate rather than coincidental, orchestrated by the Sultan himself rather than by Isabella's father or diplomatic intermediaries. He was trying to recapture something he had lost, Amara explained gently, watching Isabella's face for signs of emotional distress. Not to replace Yasmin exactly, but to have another chance to protect and nurture someone like her. He believed that with you, he could avoid the mistakes that led to her tragedy. Isabella sat in stunned silence as the implications of this revelation sank in. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about the Sultan's growing love for her, about her own unique value in his life, suddenly seemed questionable. Had he ever truly seen her as an individual, or had she always been a substitute for someone else? Were his feelings for her genuine, or were they simply projections of his guilt and grief over his first wife's fate? The questions tormented Isabella for days as she struggled to process this new information while maintaining her normal routines and responsibilities. She found herself studying the Sultan's behavior toward her with new scrutiny, looking for signs of whether he saw her as herself or as a replacement for Yasmin. She examined their conversations and interactions for evidence of substitution, wondering if his love was real or simply transferred affection from a woman who was no longer alive to receive it. The crisis came to a head when Isabella could no longer contain her emotional turmoil. She confronted the Sultan directly, demanding an explanation for the deception and expressing her anger at being chosen as a surrogate rather than valued for her own qualities. The conversation took place in the same garden where they had first acknowledged their love for each other. But now the atmosphere was charged with hurt and betrayal rather than affection. "Is any of this real?" Isabella asked, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "Your feelings for me, our partnership, the future we have been planning together. Or am I just a convenient replacement for the wife you could not save?" The Sultan's response revealed the depth of his own emotional complexity and the genuine struggle he had experienced in separating his feelings for Isabella from his memories of Yasmin. He admitted that the initial attraction had been based on similarities between the two women, but he insisted that his love for Isabella had grown from her own unique qualities and their shared experiences together. "Yes, you reminded me of Yasmin when I first saw your photograph," he said with painful honesty. "And yes, part of my motivation in requesting this marriage was the hope that I could do better by you than I had done by her. But Isabella, you must understand that love based on memory cannot sustain itself for years of real partnership. What I feel for you now is based on who you are, not on who you remind me of." Isabella wanted to believe him, but the knowledge that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of substitution and projection made it difficult for her to trust her own perceptions or his declarations. She felt that her individual identity had been erased from the very beginning, that she had been selected not for her own merit, but for her ability to serve as a replacement for someone else. The confrontation left both of them wounded and uncertain about how to move forward. Isabella withdrew from their usual intimacy, needing space to sort through her complicated emotions without the influence of the Sultan's presence and persuasion. She threw herself into her official duties with renewed intensity, using work as a distraction from the personal crisis that was consuming her thoughts and energy. The Sultan, for his part, respected Isabella's need for distance while clearly suffering from the separation. He became quieter and more withdrawn, the vitality that had marked their recent months of happiness fading, as he struggled with his own guilt and regret about the way their marriage had begun. The palace staff noticed the change in their relationship, though they were too discreet to comment directly on the obvious tension between the royal couple. It was during this period of estrangement that Isabella made a discovery that would either destroy their marriage completely or provide a path toward genuine reconciliation. While researching historical records for one of her educational projects, she came across documents related to Yasmin's life in the palace that revealed surprising information about the Sultan's first wife and the circumstances of her death. The documents showed that Yasmin had struggled not just with depression and isolation, but with a specific fear that she was inadequate to meet the demands of her position as the Sultan's wife. She had felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed on her, and convinced that she was disappointing everyone who depended on her. Her final months had been marked by increasing anxiety about her inability to provide the Sultan with the partnership and support he needed to govern effectively. What struck Isabella most powerfully about these records was how different Yasmin's experience had been from her own, despite their superficial similarities. Where Yasmin had felt excluded from political life and uncertain about her role, Isabella had been encouraged to participate actively in governance from the beginning. Where Yasmin had struggled with isolation and cultural barriers, Isabella had been provided with mentors and support systems that helped her adapt and thrive. The contrast made Isabella realize that the Sultan had indeed learned from his mistakes with Yasmin, and had deliberately created different conditions for Isabella's success and happiness. His choice of her as a bride might have been initially motivated by her resemblance to his first wife, but his treatment of her had been shaped by his determination to avoid repeating the patterns that had led to Yasmin's tragedy. This understanding did not immediately resolve Isabella's hurt about being chosen as a substitute, but it did help her see the Sultan's behavior in a different light. She began to recognize that his efforts to protect and support her were not attempts to recreate the past, but rather genuine attempts to build something new and better, based on lessons learned from loss and failure. The path toward reconciliation began when Isabella decided to share her discoveries with the Sultan, approaching him with the historical documents and her evolving understanding of their relationship. The conversation that followed was long and difficult, filled with tears and recriminations, but also with genuine efforts to understand each other's perspectives and find a way forward together. "I cannot change the fact that you reminded me of Yasmin when we first met," the Sultan said as they sat together in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his first wife's struggles. "But I can promise you that every choice I have made in our marriage has been motivated by my desire to see you flourish as the unique individual you are. Your success in this role, your happiness in this life, your growth as a person and a leader. These things matter to me because they are yours, not because they represent some kind of redemption for my failures with Yasmin." Isabella studied his face as he spoke, looking for signs of deception or self-deception, but finding only sincerity and regret. She realized that the question was not whether their marriage had begun with mixed motives, but whether it could continue and thrive based on the genuine love and respect that had developed between them. The foundation might have been imperfect, but the structure they had built together was real and valuable and worth preserving. "I need to know that you see me," she said quietly, "not as a replacement or a second chance, but as myself. I need to know that when you look at me, you see Isabella, not Yasmin's ghost." The Sultan reached across the desk and took her hands in his, holding them gently as he made a promise that would define the rest of their time together. "When I look at you," he said with quiet intensity, "I see the woman who challenged my assumptions about governance and helped me implement reforms I never thought possible. I see the person who gave me emotional support during the corruption crisis and stood by me when other advisors counseled compromise. I see the partner who brought joy back into my life and reminded me that leadership can be about hope rather than just survival. I see Isabella, and I love Isabella, exactly as she is." His words, combined with her own growing understanding of their shared history, finally allowed Isabella to move beyond the hurt and betrayal she had been carrying. She was able to accept that their marriage had begun with complicated motivations, while also recognizing that it had evolved into something genuine and valuable that belonged entirely to them. The love between them was real, even if it had grown from imperfect soil. Their reconciliation marked the beginning of the most fulfilling period of Isabella's marriage, as she and the Sultan rebuilt their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty and mutual understanding. They were able to acknowledge the complex circumstances that had brought them together, while focusing on the genuine partnership they had created through years of shared experience and growing affection. But as they settled into this new phase of their relationship, neither of them could have anticipated the crisis that was about to test everything they had built together. The crisis would force Isabella to choose between her personal happiness and her principles, between her love for the Sultan and her commitment to the values that had defined her transformation from frightened teenager to confident leader. The true test of their marriage was still to come, and it would require all the strength and wisdom they had developed together to survive what lay ahead. The crisis that would define the final chapter of Isabella's marriage began on what should have been a day of celebration. The palace was hosting an international conference on women's education, an event that Isabella had spent months organizing, and that represented the culmination of her efforts to use her position for meaningful change. Delegates from 23 countries had gathered to share experiences and develop collaborative approaches to expanding educational opportunities for girls and women across the region. Isabella had never felt more confident in her role or more proud of her accomplishments. The conference was proceeding brilliantly, with substantive discussions and concrete commitments emerging from the various working sessions. She moved through the events with grace and authority, serving as both host and intellectual contributor to the conversations that were shaping policy for millions of women across multiple nations. It was during the conference's second day that Isabella first noticed the Sultan's unusual behavior. He seemed distracted during the opening ceremonies, frequently consulting with his personal physician and leaving important sessions to take private meetings with his closest advisors. When Isabella approached him during a break to ask if something was wrong, he assured her that he was simply managing routine government business and urged her to focus on her conference responsibilities. But that evening, as Isabella was reviewing the next day's agenda in her study, Amara appeared at her door with an expression of deep concern. The librarian had been serving as Isabella's assistant for the conference, helping coordinate logistics and manage the flow of information between delegates. Her usual calm efficiency had been replaced by obvious anxiety that immediately put Isabella on alert. "There is something happening that you need to know about," Amara said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from Isabella's desk. "The Sultan has been meeting all day with military commanders and intelligence officials. There are rumors of a serious security threat that may require immediate action." Isabella felt a chill of apprehension as she processed this information. The timing was particularly troubling, given the high-profile nature of the conference and the presence of so many international delegates in the palace. "What kind of security threat?" she asked, though she suspected that Amara's knowledge would be limited. "I do not have details," Amara admitted, "but I overheard enough to understand that it involves threats against specific individuals rather than general concerns about the conference. The Sultan has been under enormous pressure from his security advisors to take preventive action." Before Isabella could ask for more specifics, they were interrupted by the arrival of one of the Sultan's personal guards, who informed Isabella that her husband requested her immediate presence in his private office. The formal language and serious demeanor of the guard suggested that this was not a routine summons, and Isabella felt her anxiety increase as she made her way through the palace corridors. She found the Sultan in his office surrounded by documents and maps, his face drawn with exhaustion and stress. The transformation from the confident leader she had seen that morning was startling, and Isabella immediately understood that whatever crisis had emerged was far more serious than routine security concerns. "Isabella," he said, looking up as she entered the room, "thank you for coming so quickly. I am afraid I have difficult news that will affect both you personally and the conference you have worked so hard to organize." The news that followed was devastating in ways that Isabella could never have anticipated. According to intelligence reports that had been confirmed through multiple sources, a radical extremist group was planning an assassination attempt that specifically targeted Isabella as a symbol of Western influence and women's liberation in the region. The threat was credible and imminent, with evidence suggesting that the attack would occur during the conference's final ceremony the following day. "The security assessment is clear," the Sultan explained, his voice heavy with regret and concern. "There is no way to guarantee your safety if you remain in the palace during the conference's conclusion. My advisors are unanimous in their recommendation that you be moved to a secure location immediately, and that the conference be terminated rather than risk your life or the lives of the international delegates." Isabella listened to this explanation in stunned silence, struggling to process the implications of what she was hearing. The conference represented months of work and years of relationship building, bringing together people and resources that might never again be assembled in the same way. To cancel it at the last moment would not only waste all that effort, but would send a message of defeat to extremist forces and discouragement to progressive allies. "How reliable is this intelligence?" she asked, forcing herself to focus on practical questions rather than emotional reactions. "Are we certain that the threat is real and not some kind of disinformation designed to disrupt the conference?" The Sultan's response revealed the depth of his own anguish about the situation. "The intelligence comes from 3 independent sources, including contacts who have provided accurate information in the past. The threat assessment team has concluded that there is at least an 80% probability that an attack will be attempted if you remain visible and accessible tomorrow." Isabella absorbed this information while considering her options, none of which seemed acceptable. She could follow the security recommendations and effectively abandon the conference and its participants, demonstrating that terrorist threats could successfully disrupt legitimate political activities. Alternatively, she could insist on remaining and completing the conference, accepting significant personal risk, and potentially endangering others if the security assessments proved accurate. "What about additional security measures?" she asked, exploring possibilities that might allow the conference to continue safely. "Could we move the final ceremony to a more secure location, or limit attendance to reduce the risk of infiltration?" The Sultan shook his head, indicating that such alternatives had already been considered and rejected by his security team. "The risk assessment is based on the assumption that you will be a target regardless of the specific venue or security arrangements. The only way to eliminate the danger is to remove you from any public setting where the extremists might have access." As Isabella wrestled with this impossible choice, she realized that the decision would define not only the immediate outcome of the conference, but the broader question of how she and the Sultan would respond to threats against their progressive agenda. If they allowed extremist intimidation to force the cancellation of a women's education conference, it would set a precedent that could undermine every reform they had fought to achieve. "I cannot run away," she said finally, looking directly into the Sultan's eyes. "If I allow this threat to force me into hiding, it will encourage more threats and more attempts to silence progressive voices through intimidation. The women attending this conference have taken risks to be here, and I will not abandon them because extremists want to frighten me." The Sultan's response revealed the depth of his love for Isabella and his terror at the prospect of losing her. "I understand your reasoning," he said quietly, "but I cannot bear the thought of anything happening to you. I have already lost one wife to circumstances I could not control, and I will not lose another to threats I have the power to prevent." This was the moment when Isabella fully understood the impossible position they were both in. The Sultan's desire to protect her was motivated by genuine love and traumatic experience with loss, but accommodating that desire would require her to abandon the principles and commitments that had given her life meaning and purpose. She faced a choice between personal safety and public duty, between her husband's peace of mind and her own integrity. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of their marriage, as Isabella and the Sultan struggled to find a solution that honored both his need to protect her and her refusal to be silenced by threats. They explored every possible compromise, from reduced public appearances to enhanced security measures, but none seemed adequate to address the severity of the threat assessment. "If something happens to you," the Sultan said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I will never forgive myself for allowing it. I will have failed in the most fundamental duty of a husband, which is to keep his wife safe from harm." Isabella felt her heart breaking as she recognized the genuine anguish in his voice, but she also knew that yielding to his fears would destroy everything she had worked to build. "And if I hide from this threat," she replied gently, "I will never forgive myself for abandoning the women who look to me for leadership and example. I will have failed in the most fundamental duty of a leader, which is to stand firm in the face of intimidation." The deadlock seemed insurmountable until Isabella proposed a solution that satisfied neither of their preferences but represented the best compromise available under the circumstances. She would remain for the conference's final ceremony as planned, but she would deliver her closing remarks via video link from a secure location within the palace, rather than appearing in person before the assembled delegates. This arrangement would allow the conference to conclude successfully, while reducing Isabella's exposure to potential attack. It would demonstrate that she had not been intimidated into complete retreat while acknowledging the reality of the security concerns. Most importantly, it would preserve the Sultan's peace of mind, while allowing Isabella to fulfill her commitments to the conference participants. The final day of the conference proceeded according to this modified plan, with Isabella delivering her closing address from a secure studio while watching the delegates' reactions on video monitors. Her speech was passionate and inspiring, calling for continued collaboration on women's education initiatives and refusing to acknowledge the extremist threats that had necessitated the security precautions. "We gather here not as representatives of different nations or cultures," she said, looking directly into the camera, "but as advocates for the fundamental human right to education and opportunity. No threat or intimidation can diminish the importance of this work or our commitment to seeing it continue and flourish in every corner of our world." The delegates responded with enthusiastic applause, and the conference concluded with concrete commitments for ongoing collaboration that exceeded Isabella's most optimistic expectations. As she watched the final ceremonies from her secure location, Isabella felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration, pride in what had been accomplished, but regret that security concerns had prevented her from sharing the triumph directly with the people who had made it possible. But the extremist threat proved to be more serious and persistent than anyone had anticipated. In the weeks following the conference, intelligence reports continued to identify Isabella as a primary target for terrorist groups that viewed her as a symbol of everything they opposed about modernization and women's rights. The security restrictions that had been implemented as temporary measures became permanent features of her daily life. Isabella found herself increasingly confined to the palace, unable to travel or make public appearances without elaborate security arrangements that made genuine interaction with people nearly impossible. The educational initiatives she had launched required constant supervision from security personnel, and the women's organizations she had helped establish struggled to maintain momentum without her visible leadership and support. The isolation was devastating for someone who had thrived on public engagement and direct involvement in the causes she cared about. Isabella felt like she was disappearing again, not into her husband's shadow as she had feared in the early days of their marriage, but into a security cocoon that protected her life while suffocating her purpose. The irony was bitter. She had gained influence and respect only to have it rendered meaningless by forces beyond her control. The Sultan watched his wife's growing frustration with increasing anguish, recognizing that the security measures designed to protect her were destroying the very qualities that had made her life worth protecting. He consulted with experts and explored alternatives, but the threat assessments remained consistently dire. The extremist groups had identified Isabella as a particularly valuable target precisely because attacking her would demonstrate their ability to reach even the most protected progressive leaders. The crisis reached its breaking point 6 months after the conference, when Isabella learned that several of the educational programs she had established were being shut down due to ongoing security concerns. The women's literacy centers could not operate safely while their patron remained a terrorist target, and the international partnerships she had developed were becoming liabilities rather than assets for the organizations involved. "This is not living," Isabella told the Sultan during one of their evening conversations in the library, the space that had once been their refuge but now felt like another prison. "I am not contributing to anything meaningful, not helping anyone, not making any difference in the world. The extremists have achieved their goal without firing a single shot. They have made me irrelevant." The Sultan had no easy answers to offer, no solutions that could reconcile her need for purpose with his determination to keep her safe. They were trapped in a situation where love and duty were fundamentally incompatible, where protecting Isabella's life required destroying her reason for living. The weight of this dilemma was crushing both of them, aging the Sultan visibly and filling Isabella with a despair she had not experienced since her earliest days in the palace. It was during this period of crisis that Isabella made a decision that would either save their marriage or destroy it completely. She could not continue living as a protected symbol while the causes she cared about withered without leadership. She could not remain married to someone whose love for her required her to abandon everything that gave her life meaning. Something fundamental had to change, even if that change involved painful sacrifices for both of them. The conversation in which Isabella presented her decision to the Sultan was the most difficult of their entire relationship. She had thought carefully about her options and concluded that there was only one solution that honored both her need for purpose and his need to protect her. She would leave the palace and return to her home country, where she could resume meaningful work without endangering the progressive initiatives they had built together in his nation. "I cannot stay here and watch everything we have accomplished crumble because of threats against me," she explained, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And I cannot ask you to choose between my safety and the reforms that define your legacy as a leader. The only solution is for me to remove myself from the equation entirely." The Sultan's response was immediate and anguished. "You are not an equation to be solved," he said, reaching for her hands with desperate intensity. "You are my wife, my partner, the person I love more than my own life. I will not let terrorists drive you away from your home and your work and our life together." But Isabella had already considered every alternative and concluded that separation was the only option that allowed both of them to honor their deepest values and commitments. "This is my home now," she said softly, "and these are my people now, and this work is my calling. But I cannot fulfill that calling while I remain a target that endangers everyone around me. If I leave, the threat disappears and the work can continue." The debate that followed lasted for hours, as the Sultan desperately searched for alternatives that would allow Isabella to remain safely while continuing her important work. He offered to relocate their entire government to a more secure location, to establish new security protocols that would allow her greater freedom of movement, to negotiate with moderate elements among the extremist groups to reduce the threat against her. But Isabella had already explored all these possibilities and found them either inadequate or unacceptable. The security restrictions that would be necessary to protect her would also limit her effectiveness as a leader and advocate. The resources required to ensure her safety would be enormous and would inevitably be diverted from other important priorities. Most fundamentally, yielding to terrorist threats would set precedents that could undermine progressive causes throughout the region. "If I stay," she explained patiently, "I become a symbol of weakness rather than strength. My continued presence under heavy security sends the message that extremists can successfully intimidate their opponents into irrelevance. But if I leave voluntarily to continue the work elsewhere, I demonstrate that progressive values cannot be confined or controlled by threats and violence." The logic was unassailable, but the emotional cost was devastating for both of them. The Sultan would lose the woman who had brought joy and purpose back into his life, while Isabella would lose the partner who had helped her discover her own strength and capabilities. Their marriage, which had grown from diplomatic convenience into genuine love, would become another casualty of the extremist violence that threatened everything they had worked to build. The final weeks of Isabella's time in the palace were both precious and heartbreaking, as she and the Sultan tried to savor their remaining moments together, while preparing for a separation that might prove permanent. They knew that once Isabella left, it would be difficult if not impossible for her to return safely, given the ongoing nature of the terrorist threats. Their goodbye would likely be final, despite their mutual hope that circumstances might eventually change. Isabella spent her final days in the palace ensuring that the programs and initiatives she had established would continue effectively in her absence. She worked with Layla and other progressive leaders to develop sustainable leadership structures that did not depend on her personal involvement. She recorded video messages for future conferences and meetings, providing guidance and encouragement for the women who would carry on the work she had started. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the people who had become her friends and colleagues during 5 years of shared struggles and achievements. The palace staff who had watched her grow from a frightened teenager into a confident leader. The government officials who had learned to respect her judgment and insight. The women's organizations that had looked to her for inspiration and support. All of them would lose not just her presence, but the symbol of possibility she had represented. Amara was among the last people Isabella spoke with before her departure, and their conversation captured both the sadness of separation and the hope for continued impact. "You came here as a stranger, and became one of us," Amara said as they embraced in the library that had been the site of so many important conversations. "You leave as a sister and a teacher, and the lessons you have shared will continue to shape our work long after you are gone." The final conversation between Isabella and the Sultan took place in the garden where they had first acknowledged their love for each other, surrounded by the jasmine and orange trees that had witnessed the evolution of their relationship. They had said everything that needed to be said about their decision and their feelings, but they wanted one last moment of peaceful connection before the painful process of separation began. "I want you to know," the Sultan said, holding Isabella close as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, "that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You have made me a better leader and a better man, and I will carry that gift with me always." Isabella felt her heart breaking as she listened to these words, knowing that they were both true and insufficient to bridge the gap that circumstances had created between them. "And I want you to know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "that you saved me from disappearing into someone else's expectations and helped me discover who I really am. Whatever happens next, I will always be grateful for the courage and confidence you helped me find." Their goodbye was private and dignified, without drama or desperate attempts to change what they had both accepted as necessary. Isabella left the palace early the next morning, before most of the staff was awake, carrying only a small suitcase and the notebook she had kept throughout her time there. The Sultan did not watch her go, having said his farewell the night before, and knowing that seeing her departure would be more than his heart could bear. Isabella's return to her home country was both a homecoming and a new beginning. Her family welcomed her with relief and celebration, though they struggled to understand the complexity of her situation and the reasons for her decision to leave the palace. The media portrayed her departure as either a triumph of Western values over Eastern oppression or a tragic failure of cross-cultural marriage, but Isabella refused to engage with either interpretation. Instead, she focused on establishing a new life that honored both her experiences in the Sultan's country and her desire to continue the work that had given her such purpose and fulfillment. She founded an international organization dedicated to supporting women's education initiatives in conflict zones and politically unstable regions, drawing on the expertise and connections she had developed during her years as the Sultan's wife. The organization, which she named the Yasmin Foundation in honor of the Sultan's first wife, became a vehicle for continuing the work Isabella had started in the palace, while building new partnerships and expanding into regions where she could operate safely. She traveled extensively, speaking at conferences and universities about the importance of women's education and the challenges facing progressive movements in traditional societies. Through this work, Isabella maintained indirect contact with the people and causes she had left behind in the Sultan's country. She received regular updates from Layla and other colleagues about the progress of various initiatives, and she provided advice and support from a distance when requested. The educational programs she had established continued to flourish, proving that her departure had indeed allowed the work to proceed without the complications created by security threats. The Sultan, meanwhile, continued his own efforts to advance progressive reforms while dealing with the personal loneliness that followed Isabella's departure. He threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if trying to honor her contributions by accelerating the pace of change and modernization. The reforms they had developed together became part of his lasting legacy, demonstrating that their partnership had created something larger and more durable than their personal relationship. 5 years after Isabella's departure, she received an unexpected letter that would provide a final chapter to their story. The letter was from the Sultan himself, written in his own hand rather than dictated to a secretary, and it carried news that was both joyful and bittersweet. The extremist groups that had forced Isabella's departure had been defeated through a combination of military action and political reforms, and the security threats that had made her presence dangerous no longer existed. "The work we began together has succeeded beyond our most optimistic expectations," the Sultan wrote. "The women's education initiatives have spread throughout the region, and the cultural changes we hope to achieve have taken root in ways that cannot be reversed. You were right to leave when you did, and you were right to continue the work elsewhere. The combination of progress here and advocacy abroad has created a movement that no single threat can stop. The letter included an invitation for Isabella to return for a special ceremony recognizing the achievements of the Yasmin Foundation and the educational programs that had grown from her original efforts. The Sultan made it clear that the invitation carried no expectations about resuming their personal relationship, but was simply an opportunity to celebrate shared accomplishments and reconnect with friends and colleagues she had been forced to leave behind. Isabella spent weeks considering this invitation, weighing her desire to see the Sultan and revisit the place that had shaped her so profoundly against her uncertainty about whether such a return would be wise or appropriate. She had built a fulfilling new life that did not depend on her past role as the Sultan's wife, and she was not certain that revisiting that past would serve any constructive purpose. Ultimately, she decided to accept the invitation, not to reclaim her former position, but to witness the fruition of the work they had accomplished together, and to honor the memory of what they had shared. The return journey felt like a pilgrimage, a chance to see how the seeds they had planted had grown into a forest of opportunities and achievements that would continue long after both of them were gone. The ceremony itself was magnificent, bringing together hundreds of women whose lives had been changed by the educational programs Isabella had helped establish. She listened to speeches by graduates who had become teachers and doctors and engineers, by mothers who had learned to read alongside their daughters, by community leaders who had used their new skills to advocate for change in their own villages and neighborhoods. The most moving moment came when a young woman named Fatima, who had been among the first students in Isabella's literacy program, stood to address the assembly. 5 years ago, Fatima said, her voice strong and clear, I could not write my own name. Today, I am a teacher myself, and I have helped more than 100 other women learn to read and write. This transformation happened because someone believed that education could change lives, even when powerful people tried to stop that belief with threats and violence. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Fatima's words, understanding that this was the true measure of success. Not the positions held or the recognition received, but the actual changes in actual lives that would ripple outward through generations. The work had indeed continued and flourished, proving that the sacrifice of her personal happiness had achieved its intended purpose. Her reunion with the Sultan was private and carefully managed, taking place in the same library where they had shared so many important conversations during their marriage. He looked older and frailer than she remembered, the weight of 7 additional years and the stress of leadership showing clearly in his appearance. But his eyes still held the intelligence and kindness that had first attracted her, and his smile when he saw her was genuine and warm. You look well, he said simply, gesturing for her to sit in the chair that had once been hers during their evening discussions. The work you have been doing suits you. I have followed your accomplishments with great pride and admiration. Isabella settled into the familiar chair, feeling the strange sensation of being both at home and displaced in this space that held so many memories. And you have continued the reforms we started together, she replied. The progress here has been remarkable, even more than I had hoped when I left. They talked for hours about the changes that had occurred in both their lives and their respective work, sharing updates and insights with the easy familiarity of old colleagues who had once been much more to each other. There was sadness in their conversation, acknowledgement of what they had lost and could never reclaim, but there was also satisfaction in what they had accomplished together and separately. As their conversation drew to a close, the Sultan made one final observation that captured the essence of their shared experience. We loved each other, he said quietly, but more importantly, we loved the same things: justice, education, the possibility of positive change. That shared love created something larger than our personal relationship, something that has survived and flourished even though we could not. Isabella nodded, understanding that this was the truth they had both needed to acknowledge. Their marriage had been complicated and challenging, built on imperfect foundations, but growing into something genuine and valuable. Its end had been painful but necessary, allowing both of them to pursue their deepest commitments without compromising their integrity or safety. The night of our wedding, Isabella said, remembering the fears and expectations that had defined her arrival at the palace. I thought my life was ending. I could not have imagined that it was actually beginning, or that the journey would lead to so much purpose and fulfillment, even through difficulty and loss. The Sultan smiled at this reflection, recognizing the truth in her words. Perhaps that is the lesson of our story, he said, that sometimes the most meaningful transformations come through circumstances we would never choose, and that love can take many forms, all of them valuable. Isabella left the palace the next day, carrying with her a renewed sense of completion and peace about the choices she had made. She had seen the fruits of her labor, reconnected with old friends, and found closure with the man who had been both her husband and her partner in creating positive change. The visit had not erased the sadness of their separation, but it had confirmed that their decision had been wise and their sacrifice worthwhile. In the years that followed, Isabella continued her work with the Yasmin Foundation, expanding its reach and impact while building a legacy that honored both her own values and the memory of the woman whose name it bore. She never remarried, finding fulfillment in her work and friendships, rather than seeking to replace the unique partnership she had shared with the Sultan. The Sultan ruled for another decade, implementing reforms that transformed his country into a model of progressive governance in a challenging region. When he finally passed away peacefully at the age of 87, Isabella attended his funeral as an honored guest, representing the international community that had benefited from his vision and leadership. At the funeral, Isabella delivered a eulogy that captured both the public and private dimensions of the Sultan's legacy. He was a man who loved deeply and wisely, who knew that sometimes love requires letting go, and who never stopped believing in the possibility of positive change. As Isabella stood beside the Sultan's grave in the palace cemetery, surrounded by the jasmine and orange trees they had walked among during their years together, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a frightened 18-year-old bride to a confident woman leader whose work had touched thousands of lives across multiple continents. He was a leader who understood that true strength comes not from power over others, but from empowering others to find their own strength, she said to the assembled mourners. The wedding night that had begun with fear and uncertainty had indeed ended with revelation. Not the kind anyone could have predicted, but the profound understanding that love and purpose could coexist in complex and unexpected ways. Isabella had discovered that she could honor both her commitment to her husband and her commitment to her values, even when those commitments led in different directions. Her final entry in the notebook she had kept throughout her marriage captured the essence of what she had learned. I came to this place believing that marriage meant the end of my individual identity. I discovered instead that the right partnership can help you become more fully yourself than you ever imagined possible. The love we shared was real and valuable, even though it could not overcome every obstacle. The work we accomplished together created ripples that continue to spread, touching lives we will never know in ways we cannot measure. That is perhaps the most profound form of love, the kind that transcends personal happiness to create lasting positive change in the world. Isabella closed the notebook for the final time and placed it in her suitcase, alongside the other mementos of her extraordinary journey. Tomorrow she would return to her own country and her own life, carrying with her the confidence and wisdom she had gained through years of challenge and growth and service to others. The young woman who had once feared disappearing into someone else's expectations had instead discovered her own strength and voice and purpose. She had learned that true freedom comes not from avoiding all constraints, but from choosing which constraints serve your deepest values and commitments. She had found that love, in its highest form, means wanting the best for someone even when that means letting them go. As her plane lifted off from the desert runway and carried her back toward home, Isabella looked down at the palace complex where she had spent 5 transformative years of her life. From this distance, the buildings looked small and fragile against the vast expanse of sand and sky, but she knew that the changes created within those walls had already spread far beyond their boundaries and would continue to grow and flourish for generations to come. The story that had begun with an arranged marriage between an 18-year-old girl and a 72-year-old sultan had become something neither of them could have anticipated, a testament to the power of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of love that sometimes requires sacrifice but never requires the abandonment of principle. It was a story of transformation and growth, of discovering strength in unexpected places, and of finding ways to honor both heart and conscience even when they point in different directions. Most importantly, it was a story that proved that even in the most challenging circumstances, it is possible to create meaning and purpose and positive change. The wedding night that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, not just for Isabella, but for all the women whose lives had been changed by the work she had initiated and the example she had provided. The revelation of that wedding night had not been what anyone expected, but it had been profound nonetheless. The understanding that love comes in many forms, that strength can grow from the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not through confrontation but through patient, persistent commitment to positive change. Isabella's story was one of many such stories unfolding around the world, wherever people chose courage over comfort, principle over convenience and hope over fear. It was a reminder that individual choices can have collective impact, that personal transformation can contribute to social progress, and that love, in all its complex and sometimes painful forms, remains the most powerful force for positive change in the world.